At my son's rehearsal dinner, I was standing near the kitchen doorway holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched in 20 minutes. The room was full of flowers and candlelight, and the kind of careful happiness that precedes a wedding. My son looked handsome. His fiancée looked radiant. I remember thinking how strange it was that I could stand in the middle of so much warmth and feel absolutely nothing but cold. That was the night my husband of 34 years looked at his sister across a table crowded with antipasto and fresh bread and said, in Italian, that the paperwork would be finished before the end of the month. That by the time I figured out what was happening, there would be nothing left to fight over. I took a slow sip of my water. I set the glass down carefully on a side table, and I smiled at my daughter-in-law's mother, who was making her way toward me with open arms. Because I had understood every single word. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a high school history teacher and a woman who sewed quilts for church fundraisers. My childhood was quiet and decent and entirely without drama. I studied hard, kept my head down, graduated from Ohio State with a degree in library science, and took a job at an elementary school in Nashville in the fall of 1988. I was 27 years old, and I thought the most adventurous thing I had ever done was move to a city where I didn't know a single soul. I met my husband at a charity auction 8 months after I arrived. He was tall, with dark eyes and a confidence that filled a room without being loud about it. His family had built a successful flooring and tile business over 3 generations, and he carried that legacy the way some men carry a good suit, like it belonged to him, like it always had. He brought me a glass of wine I hadn't asked for, and introduced himself as Vincent Caruso, and he said my name back to me like he'd been practicing it. We were married in October of 1990. I was 29 years old. His family was large and warm and overwhelming in equal measure. His parents had both been born in Calabria and came to America as young adults. They raised 4 children in a house in East Nashville, where Italian was the language of the kitchen, of arguments, of love and discipline and secrets. By the time I married into the family, my mother-in-law spoke English well enough to manage, but when emotions ran high, or when she and my husband and his sister wanted to speak freely, they switched without warning and without apology. I didn't speak a word of Italian when I married Vincent. He knew that. His whole family knew that. And for a long time, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that languages are just habits, that families have their own rhythms, that I was lucky to have married into something so close-knit and alive. The first time I felt something shift was about 3 years into the marriage. We were at Sunday dinner at his parents' house. His sister, Teresa, was visiting from Atlanta, and the wine was flowing, and at some point the conversation drifted entirely into Italian, the way it always did. I was helping clear plates, moving back and forth from the dining room to the kitchen, and I caught the word for money solgi, and then my name, and then laughter. Not cruel laughter, but private laughter, the kind that has edges. I didn't say anything. I went back to the kitchen and rinsed a serving dish and told myself I was imagining things, but I didn't imagine it. And somewhere in the weeks that followed, I made a quiet decision. I checked out every Italian language resource our school library had. I ordered workbooks and cassette tapes from a catalog. This was 1993. Long before you could pull up a language app on your phone, and I worked through those materials the way I had always approached anything difficult, methodically, privately, without telling anyone. I practiced in the car on my commute. I listened to Italian radio stations on Sunday mornings while Vincent slept. Within 18 months, I could follow most of a conversation. Within 3 years, I was fluent enough to understand everything. I told myself I never said anything because it would embarrass my husband, that revealing I had been listening all those years would damage something fragile between his family and me. But that wasn't entirely honest. The real reason was simpler and harder to admit. I had learned what I was married to, and I needed time to understand what to do about it. Vincent was not a cruel man in any obvious way. He never raised his voice to me. He never threatened me. He remembered our anniversary and brought me flowers when he came back from business trips and told people at parties that I was the most patient woman he had ever known. Patience was his word for it. I came to understand that what he called my patience was something else entirely. He had suggested, gently and early, that it made more sense for him to manage our finances. His business was complex, he said. The accounts were intertwined. It would be easier if I simply had a household account for groceries and incidentals and let him handle the rest. I agreed because I trusted him and because I had never been particularly interested in money beyond having enough of it. Within 5 years, I had no idea what we owned, what we owed, or what our life together was actually worth on paper. I raised our son, Daniel. I worked full-time as a school librarian and later as head librarian at a branch of the public library system. I kept the house and organized the holidays and remembered the birthdays of every member of his extended family. I was present at every dinner, every baptism, every graduation. I learned Italian in secret and I listened and I waited. What I heard over those years was not dramatic. There were no confessions of affairs, no conspiracies. Mostly I heard a man who spoke about me to his family in terms I never would have chosen for myself. She doesn't understand business. She wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. She's happy, she doesn't need to know. She's not like us. He said these things without malice, which somehow made them worse. He genuinely believed them. I had become, in his mind, something he managed rather than someone he shared a life with. His sister Teresa was the sharper edge of it. I had always sensed her watchfulness, the way she inventoried me at family gatherings, but once I could understand her, I heard what she actually thought. She believed I had married her brother for stability. She told their mother once, in a kitchen in Atlanta while I was supposed to be napping in the guest room, that I was soft morbida. She sorrowed, like dough, that I would never cause problems, because I didn't have the spine for it. I lay in that guest room and stared at the ceiling fan and thought about my grandmother, who had raised 5 children alone after her husband died of a stroke at 42. I thought about my mother, who had gone back to school at 50 to finish her teaching degree. I thought about the word soft, and what it costs a woman to let people believe it about her. I did not cry. I had learned not to spend tears on things I couldn't yet change. Daniel got engaged in the spring of his 32nd year to a woman named Claire, who was a physical therapist from Knoxville and who I liked immediately and completely. She was warm and direct, and she looked at my son the way I had wanted to be looked at for a long time. I was genuinely happy for them in a way that surprised me with its cleanliness, because by that point, most of my emotions felt complicated and secondhand. The rehearsal dinner was held at an Italian restaurant in Midtown Nashville that Vincent had chosen. Of course he had chosen it. He chose most things. The private dining room was beautiful, strung with soft lights, and Claire's family had driven up from Knoxville, and everyone was making that particular effort that precedes a wedding, the effort of becoming a new combined thing. I was moving between conversations the way you do at those events, when you know your primary role is logistical, making sure the wine was circulating, checking that the seating was comfortable, holding space so that the younger people could be the center of it. It was a role I had been performing for 34 years, and I was very good at it. I stepped toward the kitchen doorway to let a server pass, and that's when I heard them. Vincent and Teresa were standing in a small alcove near the service corridor, close together, speaking quietly in Italian the way they always did when they didn't want to be overheard. Teresa had a glass of Barolo, and her voice had the low, efficient register it took on when she was discussing practical matters. She said, "The asset transfer needs to be completed by the end of the month." He said, "It will be." The attorney said 3 to 4 weeks. She said, "And she has no idea?" He said, "None. You know how she is." She said, "Good, because if she knew what everything was worth now, it would get complicated, and I don't want complicated at my nephew's wedding." He said, "It won't be complicated. It's already done on paper. She just doesn't know it yet." Teresa laughed softly and touched her brother's arm and said something about timing, about waiting until after the honeymoon, about how these things are easier when everyone is in a good mood. I stood completely still for 3 full seconds. A server excused himself past me with a tray of desserts. I stepped aside. I walked back into the dining room, and I found Claire's mother, a lovely woman from Tennessee who collected vintage postcards and volunteered at a cat rescue, and I asked her how she was enjoying Nashville, and I listened to her answer with complete attention. My hands were steady. My voice was steady. Years of practice. What I did not tell anyone at that dinner, or that night, or for several weeks afterward, was that I had been to see a divorce attorney of my own 4 months earlier. I want to be honest about how that came to pass, because I think it matters. I had not gone looking for a reason to leave my marriage. I had been trying, in my quiet way, to understand what I was living inside of. A friend from work, a woman I trusted who had been through her own divorce in her late 50s, had suggested I speak to someone just to know my options, just to understand the landscape. She said knowing is different from deciding. She said information is not the same as action. She was right. I met with an attorney named Susan, whose office was in a building downtown that smelled like good coffee and document storage. And I sat across from her desk and I told her the outline of my marriage, and she asked me questions I had never thought to ask myself. She asked about joint accounts and separate accounts. She asked about business assets and property titles. She asked about retirement funds and investment portfolios. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and she started writing things down. And by the end of that first meeting, I understood that I knew almost nothing about my own financial life and that this had not happened by accident. I went home that evening and I made dinner, and I sat across the table from my husband of 33 years, and I watched him talk about a tile contract he'd won in Birmingham, and I thought, I have been living in a house whose floor plan I was never shown. After the rehearsal dinner, I called Susan the next morning. I told her what I had heard. I told her I had heard it in Italian, that I had understood every word, and that I had been understanding Italian for 30 years without my husband's knowledge. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a tone that was professional but not entirely without warmth, that this changed the timeline considerably and that we should meet as soon as possible. What followed was not clean or simple. I want to say that because the stories we tell about leaving make it sound like there's a moment of clarity and then forward motion, and that is only partly true. There were days when I sat in my car in the library parking lot and asked myself whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life. There were nights when I watched my husband sleep and tried to find, underneath everything I now knew, some version of the man I had married that I could still recognize. Sometimes I found him. Mostly I found someone I had invented and tended like a houseplant for 3.5 decades. The asset transfer he and Teresa had discussed was real. Susan's forensic accountant found it. Money that should have been marital property had been quietly moved into a family LLC in his sister's name over the course of several months. It was not simple financial misbehavior. It was a plan, and plans require a planner. I served him the divorce papers on a Tuesday in October, exactly 34 years after our wedding date. I did not plan that timing consciously, but I did not change it when I realized it. He stared at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at me in a way I had not seen before, not angry, not guilty, but genuinely uncertain, like I had just spoken to him in a language he didn't know I spoke. And I thought, yes, exactly like that. He asked me what I knew. I told him everything. I told him about the rehearsal dinner, about the kitchen in Atlanta 12 years ago, about Sunday dinners and business conversations and the small private accounting I had been keeping in my head since 1993. I told him in English, because I had spent 30 years being careful, and I felt no need to be dramatic about it now. He didn't deny any of it. He said, after a long silence, that he had thought he was protecting me, that he had thought I was happy, that he didn't understand how I could have been listening all this time and never said anything. I told him I had been waiting until I understood what I was dealing with. The divorce took 11 months. Susan was thorough and unsentimental, and occasionally fierce, and the asset transfer was reversed and the settlement was fair, which is a word that sounds modest but felt enormous to me by the time it was over. I kept the house for 1 year, and then I sold it, because I did not need 5 bedrooms, and because I wanted to choose my own floor plan for the first time. I was 63 years old on the day I signed the final papers. I drove home through a Nashville afternoon in early September, the light coming in low and gold the way it does at the end of summer here, and I thought about a conversation I'd had with Daniel a few weeks before. He had asked me, carefully, if I was scared. He is a gentle young man, and he had been watching me navigate all of this with the slightly helpless concern of a child who realizes his parents are separate people with separate inner lives. I told him no, and I meant it, which surprised me a little. I wasn't scared. I had been scared for years. Quietly, in the background of everything, scared of what I didn't know, scared of what I did know, scared of the distance between them. The fear I had been managing for so long had a shape and a weight I had grown accustomed to carrying. What I felt on the day I signed those papers was not the absence of fear, it was the absence of the need for it. I live now in a smaller house in East Nashville, 3 miles from where I spent the first year after my divorce, and 4 miles from Daniel and Claire, who had their first child last spring. My granddaughter is named Frances, which was my grandmother's name, and when I hold her, I feel the specific gratitude of someone who made it to the other side of something. I still work at the library 2 days a week, which was a choice I made for pleasure rather than necessity. I started taking a cooking class on Thursday evenings, Italian of course, and the instructor complimented my pronunciation on the 3rd week and asked if I had studied abroad. I smiled and said no, I had just been paying attention for a long time. I think about what 34 years of silence cost me. I think about it honestly, because I owe myself that. I think about the versions of myself that might have existed if I had spoken sooner, acted sooner, understood sooner what it means to share your life fully with someone rather than be managed by them. I sit with those thoughts when they come and I don't rush them out the door. But I also think about this. The woman who sat in Susan's office that first afternoon and realized she didn't know the floor plan of her own life. She was 62 years old and she was frightened and she had no idea what came next. And she still walked through the door anyway. She still asked the question. She still chose to know. That woman did not wait for someone to rescue her. She did not wait to feel ready. She did not wait for permission or certainty or a sign that the timing was right. She was 62 years old and she had been soft in everyone else's estimation for most of her adult life, and she opened a door that turned out not to have been locked after all. I had spent 3 decades believing that the cage I lived in was a feature of my life, not a choice. I had mistaken his certainty for the truth about me. I had confused his silence with mine. What I know now, on the other side of it, is this. The information was always available. The exit was always there. What changed was not the situation. What changed was the moment I decided that knowing was worth more than the comfort of not knowing. Frances grabbed my finger this morning at 6:15 while her parents slept and looked at me with the enormous, unfiltered seriousness that babies have, and I told her, quietly, in Italian, that she was going to be magnificent, that she came from women who paid attention, that the world was going to make certain assumptions about her and she should let it, because being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you agree with the assessment. She looked at me for a long moment and then grabbed my thumb with both hands, and I took that as agreement. I was 63 years old when I started over. I was 63 and I was more myself than I had been at 29 when I said I do, in a church in Nashville with flowers in my hair and a whole life ahead of me that I didn't yet know how to claim. It turns out 63 is not too late. It turns out 63 is just the age I happened to be when I finally stopped pretending not to understand.